I spent 46 years building a home with my husband. I raised our daughter there. I buried the man I loved, surrounded by memories we created together. Then one day, my own family looked at me and said, "Be glad we still let you visit." Visit. Those 6 words cut deeper than any betrayal I had ever known. What happened after that changed everything I believed about family, inheritance, and the price of staying silent when people slowly erase you from your own life. Before I continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. One of the few comforts I've found over the last few years is knowing that stories like mine reach people all over the world. Sometimes complete strangers understand our pain better than our own families do. So please leave your city, state, or country in the comments below. I read as many of them as I can, and they remind me that none of us are truly alone. My name is Patricia Whitmore. I'm 72 years old, and I live in Oregon. 3 years ago, if someone had told me that I would eventually be afraid to walk through my own front door, I would have laughed. Not because I was brave. Not because life had always been easy. But because I believed I knew my family. I was married to my husband Daniel for 46 years. 46 years. When you've loved someone that long, your lives become stitched together in ways that are impossible to explain. Every room in our house carried part of him. Every shelf held a memory. Every habit had his fingerprints on it. Daniel worked at the shipping yard for most of his life. Long hours. Early mornings. Sore muscles. He never complained. I spent my career working at our local library. We weren't wealthy people. We weren't glamorous. But we built a good life. A steady life. The kind of life where promises mattered. The kind of life where family mattered. And at the center of that life was our daughter, Veronica. She was our only child. Not because we planned it that way. Life simply made that decision for us. So Daniel and I poured everything we had into her. Every extra dollar. Every extra hour. Every sacrifice. When she wanted piano lessons, we found the money. When she needed college tuition, we worked longer. When she struggled, we stood behind her. When she succeeded, we celebrated harder than anyone else. Looking back now, I don't regret loving my daughter. I don't regret sacrificing for her. Parents don't keep score that way. At least good parents don't. For many years, our life felt blessed. Daniel and I bought our home in 1978. It wasn't fancy. The roof leaked. The kitchen was tiny. The wallpaper was terrible. But it was ours. We painted those walls ourselves. We planted flowers in the front yard. We raised Veronica in that house. Christmas mornings happened there. Thanksgiving dinners happened there. Birthday candles were blown out there. School photos were taken on the front porch. Every important chapter of our lives seemed to begin or end inside those walls. Some of my happiest memories still live there. I can still see Daniel standing beside the Christmas tree pretending he didn't know what presents he had bought. I can still hear Veronica running down the hallway on Thanksgiving mornings asking when dinner would be ready. Back then, family felt permanent. Safe. Unbreakable. And maybe that's why I never saw the danger when it first appeared. Because betrayal rarely arrives looking like betrayal. Sometimes it arrives looking like concern. Sometimes it arrives looking like help. Sometimes it arrives looking exactly like love. Everything changed in March of 2020. Daniel died suddenly from a heart attack. One moment he was in our garden. The next moment he was gone. The silence afterward was unbearable. For weeks, I found myself setting 2 plates at dinner before remembering there was only one person left to eat. The house felt larger, darker, colder. Every room reminded me of what I had lost. I tried to stay busy. I tried to stay strong. But loneliness has a way of finding you in the quiet moments. And that's when Veronica called. Her voice sounded warm, concerned, loving. She said she had been worried about me. She said she didn't want me living alone. She said she had an idea that could help all of us. At the time, I thought it was the kindest conversation I'd heard since Daniel died. I thought it was love. I was wrong. And there was one small detail in that conversation that didn't feel right. Not enough to alarm me. Not enough to stop me. But enough that years later, I would remember it and realize that the warning had been there from the very beginning. When Veronica and Keith moved in, it felt like life had given me a second chance. The house sounded alive again. Brandon laughed in the living room. Ashley followed me into the kitchen asking questions about old family recipes. Veronica hugged me every morning before work. One evening she smiled and said, "See, Mom? You're not alone anymore." My chest warmed. For the first time since Daniel died, I believed I might be okay. Then, 2 weeks later, Veronica knocked on my bedroom door. "Mom, can we talk?" "Of course." She sat on the edge of the bed. "Keith's back has been acting up. The adjustable bed in the master bedroom would really help him." I nodded slowly. "And where would I sleep?" "The guest room." "Just for now." "Just for now." I felt my fingers tighten around the blanket. Daniel and I had slept in that room for 46 years. Still, I forced a smile. "If it helps him." "Thank you, Mom." That night I carried my clothes into a room half the size. I stood there staring at the unfamiliar walls. I told myself it was temporary. I was wrong. A week later, I heard heavy footsteps downstairs. 2 movers carried Daniel's favorite leather chair toward the basement. "Wait," I said. "What are you doing?" Keith barely looked up. "We need more space for the entertainment setup." That was Daniel's chair. "We'll keep it safe." The basement door slammed shut. My stomach dropped. Over the next few days, more things disappeared. My grandmother's rocking chair. Our wedding photograph. The small table Daniel built with his own hands. Every time I asked, I heard the same answer. "It's only temporary." One afternoon I ran my hand across an empty section of wall where our wedding photo had hung for decades. The paint behind it was brighter than the rest. Like a ghost refusing to leave. For the first time I wondered why every change seemed to remove a piece of our history. But something else happened before I found the answer. The kitchen stopped feeling like mine. I came downstairs one morning looking for my favorite saucepan. It wasn't there. Neither were half my utensils. "Veronica?" She looked up from her phone. "Oh." I reorganized everything. "Without asking me?" "We're trying to make things more efficient." I opened cabinet after cabinet. Nothing was where it belonged. Dinner moved from 6 o'clock to 8. My recipes disappeared behind grocery lists I hadn't written. One night I started cooking chicken the way Daniel liked it. Keith walked in and frowned. "We don't really eat like that anymore." Anymore. The words landed harder than they should have. I stood there holding a wooden spoon, suddenly feeling like a guest asking permission to use my own stove. The next morning I found another surprise. A lock. A brand new lock on Daniel's old office. I stared at it for several seconds. When Keith came downstairs, I pointed toward the door. Why is there a lock? Confidential client files. This used to be Daniel's room. Now it's my workspace. His answer came so quickly it felt rehearsed. I touched the cold brass handle. Locked. Just like that. One more room gone. One more piece of Daniel gone. One more reminder that the house I loved seemed to be shrinking around me. That night I walked past the office again. Light glowed beneath the door. I could hear Keith talking inside. I almost knocked. I put them in the attic. The attic? They were taking up space. My pulse stumbled. I can't safely climb into the attic. You can ask someone if you need them. If I need them. As if 46 years of my life were seasonal decorations. Days later I noticed something else missing. Our wedding photograph. The silver frame Daniel had polished every Christmas. Have you seen it? I asked. Keith shrugged. We've been decluttering. Decluttering. The word hit harder than it should have. Soon Daniel's old chair disappeared. Then several keepsakes. Then boxes I didn't even remember moving. A terrible realization settled over me. They weren't just removing objects. They were removing evidence that Daniel had ever been there. Expectation. A home filled with memories. Reality. A house being stripped clean. The damage was simple and devastating. They weren't just erasing things. They were erasing Daniel. And before I could process that loss, they came for something else. One morning I walked outside and froze. My Toyota Camry was gone. The driveway looked wrong without it. Veronica. She appeared at the door. Where's my car? Keith took it to a mechanic. Why? The check engine light came on. No, it didn't. 2 days later the car returned. Along with a repair bill for nearly $4,000. I stared at the number. There must be a mistake. Keith folded his arms. The mechanic said the vehicle wasn't safe. I paid it. What choice did I have? Then, a few weeks later, I noticed I hadn't seen the car again. Where is it now? Veronica hesitated. Keith answered instead. We sold it. The room tilted. You sold my car? You weren't really using it. My fingers went cold. What happened to the money? Neither of them answered immediately. That silence told me more than words ever could. That night I sat alone in my small room. The albums were gone. The photographs were gone. The chair was gone. The car was gone. Every month seemed to take something else. Every conversation seemed to leave me smaller. I stared at Daniel's last picture on my nightstand. For years that house had been the center of my life. Now it felt like I was living inside someone else's plans. The most painful part wasn't losing things. It was realizing nobody even asked. And as I sat there in the dark, one question kept returning. Was this all carelessness? Or was I being slowly pushed out of my own life? I still didn't know. What I didn't realize was that the worst betrayal hadn't happened yet. It was already coming. And it was much closer than I imagined. Thanksgiving had always belonged to Daniel and me. I woke before sunrise and started cooking. The turkey went into the oven. The cranberry sauce simmered on the stove. By noon, the house smelled exactly the way it had for decades. For a few hours, I felt like myself again. I ironed Daniel's mother's linen napkins. I arranged fresh flowers from the garden. I set the table with the good china we had saved for special occasions. Then Keith's parents arrived. Diane kissed Veronica on the cheek. "This house looks wonderful." "Thank you," Veronica said. My hands froze around a serving bowl. She didn't mention who had cooked. She didn't mention who had decorated. She didn't mention whose house it was. I told myself not to be sensitive. I was wrong. When dinner began, Keith stood at the head of the table. Daniel's seat. The seat no one had ever taken before. He raised his glass. "I'd like to thank Veronica for opening her home to all of us this year." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. Her home. Not one person corrected him. Not Veronica. Not Diane. Not Robert. No one. Then Veronica smiled and said, "It's been a lot of work, but it's worth it." The room filled with laughter. My chest tightened. I looked around the table searching for someone, anyone, to notice what had just happened. Nobody did. Or nobody cared. A minute later, I realized something else. My usual seat was gone. I had been moved to the far end of the table beside the wall. A place setting squeezed into a corner. I sat down slowly. "Mom, that's your spot now," Veronica said. "Your spot now." The words landed like a slap. For 46 years, I had hosted Thanksgiving in that dining room. Now I felt like an invited guest. No. Not even that. Guests are welcomed. I was being tolerated. Expectation, a family gathering. Reality, watching strangers rewrite my life while I sat in the room. The damage was unbearable. In my own home. I no longer existed. Dinner continued. Keith discussed work. His father discussed investments. The conversation flowed around me as if I were invisible. Then Keith placed his fork down. "There is something Veronica and I wanted to discuss." The room grew quieter. I felt my stomach tighten. "What is it?" I asked. Keith folded his hands. "You're getting older, Patricia." The way he said my name felt deliberate. Cold. "We've been thinking about your future." "My future?" Veronica nodded. "This house is becoming too much responsibility." I stared at her. "What are you talking about?" Keith leaned forward. "There are some excellent senior communities nearby." My pulse began pounding. "You want me to move?" "We want what's best for everyone," Veronica said quickly. "For everyone," I repeated. Keith nodded. "If the house were sold, the proceeds could be divided fairly. You'd have money for care, and we'd have stability for the kids." The room blurred for a second. Suddenly every missing photograph, every moved chair, every locked door made sense. They weren't planning around me. They were planning beyond me. If you've ever been treated like a burden by your own family, please subscribe. Stories like this happen more often than people think, and no one should have to face them alone. I don't remember much after that. Only the sound of dishes. The sound of laughter. The sound of my heart breaking. I walked upstairs and closed the bedroom door behind me. For several minutes, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at Daniel's photograph. Tears slid down my face. I had spent my whole life building a home for my family. That night, for the first time, I wondered if my family had been waiting for me to disappear. And I still didn't know the worst part. Because what I would discover next would prove that Thanksgiving wasn't the end of their plan. It was only the beginning. That night, I sat alone in my room holding Daniel's photograph. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I wiped my eyes, opened a drawer, and pulled out the old property documents Daniel had always insisted on keeping organized. I could almost hear his voice. Always know what you own, Pat. Never sign anything you don't understand. At the time, I smiled through my tears. I thought I was grieving my husband. I didn't realize I was about to need his advice. A few days later, I heard voices downstairs. Keith's office door wasn't completely shut. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was simply walking past. Then I heard my name. I stopped. The property is still in her name, Keith said. My pulse jumped. Another voice answered through the speakerphone. What about conservatorship? The word hit me like ice water. Keith lowered his voice. We may have grounds. I gripped the wall. Conservatorship. Legal control. Control over finances. Control over decisions. Control over everything. In that moment, the pieces finally connected. They didn't want to take care of me. They wanted to own me. I barely remember leaving the hallway. I only remember driving to Carol's house. When she opened the door, I broke down. After listening to everything, she grabbed her purse. We're calling Margaret. The next morning, I sat across from attorney Margaret Chin. She reviewed the documents quietly. Then she looked up. Patricia, you are the sole owner. Completely? Completely. My shoulders loosened for the first time in months. Can they force me out? No. Can they take the house? No. Can they control my assets? Not unless you let them. A new feeling replaced the fear. Not anger. Clarity. For 3 years, I had been reacting. Now I was finally going to act. Margaret slid a folder across the desk. First, we evict them. I stared at the papers. Then what? That part is up to you. A week later, legal notices were prepared. The eviction process began. The house was listed for sale. Every document carried my signature. Every decision belonged to me. Not Keith. Not Veronica. Me. They thought I was weak. But they forgot who built that house. They forgot who spent decades paying every mortgage bill. They forgot who survived grief, cancer, and loss long before they ever arrived. For the first time in years, I wasn't watching my life disappear. I was taking it back. What I didn't know was how desperate Veronica and Keith would become once they realized their inheritance was slipping through their fingers. And their reaction would reveal exactly who they had become. 3 weeks after the eviction notice was served, the house received multiple offers. The highest came in at $745,000. I signed the papers quietly. No celebration. No speech. Just a signature. Then Veronica called. Mom, please don't do this. Her voice shook. We can fix this. I closed my eyes. Can we? Please. The kids need that house. The kids. Not me. Not Daniel. The house. I felt my grip tighten around the phone. For years, I had believed they saw a mother. Now I understood they saw an asset. Mom, we're begging you. I waited a moment. Then I answered softly. You should have thought about that before. The call started that same night. 1 missed call. Then 3. Then 7. By midnight, my phone screen was filled with Veronica's name. I listened to the first voicemail. "Mom. Please call me back. We can talk about this." The second sounded different. Less confident. More frightened. "Mom, Keith says the lawyer must be wrong. There has to be a misunderstanding." By the fifth message, she was crying. "We never thought you'd actually sell it." I sat quietly in my cottage rental, staring at the phone. Never thought I'd actually sell it. Not apologize. Not we were wrong. Not we hurt you. Only fear. Fear that the house was slipping away. The next morning, Keith called. For the first time since he moved into my home, his voice carried no arrogance. "Patricia, let's be reasonable." Reasonable. The word almost made me laugh. I remembered my wedding photo disappearing. Daniel's chair in the basement. The locked office. The Thanksgiving dinner. The seat at the end of the table. Every insult they expected me to absorb quietly. "There's nothing left to discuss," I said. "Think about the grandchildren." "I have." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Because for the first time, he understood something I had finally learned. People who truly care about you talk about you. People who want something from you talk about what you own. Over the next week, the messages became more desperate. Then angry. Then desperate again. Not once did they ask how I was doing. Not once did they ask if I was lonely. Not once did they ask if I missed Daniel. And that hurt more than everything else. Because in the end, I realized they weren't mourning the loss of a home. They were mourning the loss of access. Access to my house. Access to my money. Access to my future. But never to me. A few days later, Veronica asked to meet. She apologized. Keith stayed silent. I listened. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't try to hurt them. When she finally stopped talking, I simply said, "The house is sold." Nothing else needed to be said. A month later, I moved into a small cottage surrounded by trees and quiet mornings. The first thing I hung on the wall was Daniel's photograph. The second thing I planted was a row of rose bushes beneath the front window. For the first time in years, every room felt peaceful. Every chair belonged where it stood. Every memory had a place again. I didn't get my family back. I got myself back. And sometimes, that's the greater victory. Thank you for listening to my story. Because if my experience taught me anything, it's this: the people who truly love you never make you feel like a visitor in your own life. And if someone does, don't wait as long as I did to see the truth.